Hi guys, Phil here with Skweeel episode 2, documenting my Masters by Research project. We're here in SA Byron Bay's beautiful SSL 9000K studio, which they're letting me use. Thanks guys, much appreciated. And today what we're going to be doing is exploring the many different ways that we can trigger internal feedback loops using the console's rather complex signal flow possibilities. If you'd like to try any of the things that I'm going to be describing today, be very careful that your console, for instance, might not like prolonged feedback loops. Its circuitry might become damaged due to that. Your speakers could be damaged by sudden spikes in level produced by the feedback loops. And most importantly, your hearing might get damaged due to the same sudden spikes in levels that would damage your speakers. So protect your hearing, be careful with your equipment. I can't be held liable now that I've said that. All right, let's dive in. On a large format console, you have to have a patch bay. It wouldn't be very practical to have all of the inputs and outputs on the console itself. Due to the size and due to the fact that you're constantly connecting, disconnecting things, you really need to have everything centralized on a patch bay. We do have our usual suspects that we can use to create internal feedback loops that you would find on a very small console or medium-sized console. Perfect example are the insert sends and returns, which appear on these two rows on the 9000K. You would have group outs, for instance, which are available on mid-sized consoles, which appear here. This one. You would have your aux sends. Even the smaller consoles have at least usually one like monitor mix aux sends, so they're available here on this console. And potentially we also have the master insert send and returns. The master output could potentially be routed back to itself, although I won't be doing that for my particular project. But that's a possibility you might want to consider. So let's go to the console itself. I'm going to start by exploring the possibilities of the insert send return loop. So this is kind of the first thing that one would try even on a small console. So if we connect the insert send back to the line input of the same channel, therefore the signal coming into the line input travels down to the insert send point, goes back to the line input, travels to the insert send point, and keeps cycling between these 2 points. And the moment we hit unity gain, or a bit more than unity gain, then we get this infinite gain happening every time the signal passes around the loop. And the more gain we apply, the more the sound transforms into this low frequency chirp. Closer to unity gain, and we usually have high frequency squeals instead. Or at least that's the case on the 9000K. I'm pretty sure that any console you would try this on, you would get different results. Now the default on the SSL-K is to have the insert point happening after the EQ. And therefore, if we activate our loop, and if we activate the EQ with its 4 bands set to unity gain, normally the sound shouldn't change much. We are now adding our equalizer into the entire loop, and therefore it's quite a tribute to how well these consoles are manufactured, because the amount of circuitry that all of a sudden gets added to be able to have such little impact on the actual loop. Remember that a single little half degree of additional gain can have that much change on the sound. So adding all of that EQ circuitry in or taking it out of the loop is quite remarkable that it doesn't change the sound more than that. So what I've noticed when I prepared this episode is that we can have interesting actions happening. Each band is actually changing the sound in ways that are not really predictable. As we'll see, the high-frequency squeals can be obtained just as easily modifying the low mid-band or the high mid-band, not necessarily just the high band. And these stranger kind of tones, which are almost throat-like, can be obtained. Cutting high frequencies kind of gives you what you expect, but boosting high frequencies definitely doesn't just boost high frequencies. This is even more obvious with the mid-band. High mids gives us this really interesting, almost throat-like, I keep calling it that, throat-like quality when a bit of subtractive gain is applied. So this is a new kind of sound that I hadn't stumbled upon yet. Very buzzy type of sound. Almost like a broken Texas Instrument Speak and Spell. For those of you who are into circuit bending, you know what I mean. So this is very promising to have all of this extra tone control by using the different bands of the equalizer. This is going to be quite difficult to categorize in terms of sounds. What I like with the low band is that we can get these very low frequency chirps. So if I combine this with maximum input gain into the loop, and if we get that to stabilize, like right now, then I'm able to get these really low frequency chirps happening, and I can use these to trigger noise gates on and off on other sounds, or to generate ducking on a group of other sounds with compressors. This is very, very promising here, what that low band can do. And it allows me quite precise control over the tempo of those chirps. Now, if only I could get them to pulse at an even slower rate, which I'm sure I'll stumble upon when I experiment a bit more with the EQ as part of the loop. So there we have it, EQ part of the loop. With this console, what you can do with this particular switch is tell the insert point that it needs to be before the EQ section. What that then allows you to do is, once you have a feedback loop happening, you can then use your EQ section more conventionally to, for instance, with a high band, take out high frequencies, or on the contrary, boost high frequencies, or with your mid band, remove some high mids, or maybe get these interesting filter sweeps happening, because the mid-range is quite rich with these signals. Same thing with the mid band. This sounds a lot like changing the pulse width modulation on a traditional subtractive synthesizer. And the low band. So this is much easier to catalog in terms of how the sounds react to the controls. Let's add the compressor into the equation by assigning it to the channel, getting a loop happening, and basically by changing the ratio, we immediately destroy the signal and we get these. The best way to describe this would be constipated flatula. I'm sure you'll agree. Let's do that again. It's got these very interesting crackles in the sound. And the fast attack, slow attack setting has a even more interesting result. So again, we get these chirps. Again, the broken Texas Instruments Speak and Spell kind of sounds when the ratio is close to 1:1. Further ratios just seem to smash the signal some more. Still producing some interesting results, but basically we're getting mostly chirps then. What I think will be interesting is this particular range, very close to a 1:1 ratio, where we can also apparently get almost ring modulator kind of sounds. So this again opens the door to a lot of different possibilities. This is basically a fast attack right there and slow attack right there. So of course, again, this is not really having any of the sounds that you would associate with, any of the behaviors that you would associate with the actions of these three pots on the resulting sound. The expander gate doesn't really seem to have any influence on the sound, not that I could find, which is quite understandable as the feedback loop is taking us to such a high level signal that we're probably never actually passing below the threshold. Even if I try to get there, not even with the threshold set to any position, I can't seem to get the signal to pass underneath it. But the controls aren't having any influence on the actual timbre of the feedback loop, which is good to know. Now if we place the compressor on the output of the signal path, then a bit like we did with the EQ happening after the feedback loop, the dynamic section is now also happening after the feedback loop and therefore not affecting the timbre of the feedback loop, but now we have a more conventional behavior of those three pots. Basically, they're applying compression to the actual signal. Now, where it gets interesting is if we apply the EQ to get these very low frequency chirps, depending on the attack setting, we'll get different results. The timbre will be slightly affected by the response time. Of the compressor affecting the level envelope. so this might come in handy. So what we've been doing so far is using the shortest type of loop possible, which is taking the insert sand and patching it back into the channel line input. What I'm going to try now is explore the different types of sounds that we get when we include everything we've seen, which is the dynamic section, the EQ section, and now even the fader. What I'm grabbing right here is the direct output. That's a signal taken post fader, and feeding that into the channel's line input. So the loop is much longer now. Let's see how it sounds. Having connected the output of this fader to the input of the channel, line input, I'm letting the input gain at 0 for now. What's going to happen is the moment that fader reaches 0 and then adds even the tiniest bit of positive gain, bam, immediately we get a feedback loop. Now we only have 10 dBs of positive gain on the fader. It was never designed to apply that amount of gain, and we're getting kind of the same result, the same kind of timbres that we were getting when we were applying positive gain using the input gain. Here we get the same kind of sound that goes into those lower flatula-like sounds. Where it gets interesting, of course, is that now the feedback loop incorporates the EQ section, for instance. So if we make sure that all of our 4 gains in the EQ bands are set to 0, activating the EQ shouldn't have a massive difference. Again, you have to realize that in an analog console, it's quite impressive to have such little difference when that much circuitry is actually added to the signal path. Changes to be expected, and that is very minor compared to even the slightest degree of rotation of either that pot up there or the slightest movement of that fader there. Yeah. So again, we find the same kind of reaction that we had earlier when we went over the effects of the EQ section inserted, and what I'm hoping to find is the same kind of interesting, there we go, throat-like signals by applying subtractive gain on the midbands. These sounds are going to be very interesting to play with. And again, using my low band, I'm expecting that I can get these very low frequency chirps, although 10 dB of gain only on the fader is quite limiting compared to how slow we can get those chirps when we add the massive amount of gain that our input gain stage allows us to do. So that's with the EQ inserted. The compressor, whether it's inserted at the beginning of the channel or at the output of the channel, shouldn't have much of an impact now. Although that does have an influence when the EQ itself is inserted, whether the compressor comes before or after the EQ, and therefore we can expect some kind of change to happen. But this is interesting here. There we go. These are some cool low frequency chirps there that can be used. Almost like some of the calls that frogs in Australia can make at night. Be interesting if I could slow that tempo even more. This will require a bit more exploration. The possibilities seem to be quite endless when the entire tools in the signal path are part of the actual feedback loop. This concludes episode 2. In the next episode, I'll be exploring more complex paths by perhaps having 2 channels interact with each other. Until then, stay safe, protect your hearing, make some great sounds. Let's have one last one for the road. See you next time.